22nd century science.
Hello and welcome to a 22nd Century Science. This is the video podcast where we talk about astrology as being not what you thought it was. Today I want to look at the Astrology and Science Wikipedia page, mainly because it's almost entirely wrong and almost entirely out of date. But we'll start with what it says about falsifiability. Now, Karl Popper was a philosopher of science, and I've mentioned him previously in these podcasts because I used his relationship as an example of one with a progressed Sun, progressed Venus trine in it. What he says, and I'm reading from the Astrology and Science Wikipedia page, is that science does not rely on induction. Instead, scientific investigations are inherently attempts to falsify existing theory through novel tests. If a single test fails, then the theory is falsified. It goes on to say that Popper regarded astrology as pseudo-empirical, in that it appeals to observation and experiment, but nevertheless does not come up to scientific standards. In contrast to scientific disciplines, astrology does not respond to falsification through experiment. And according to Professor of Neurology Terence Hines, this is a hallmark of pseudoscience. What I think that Karl Popper was doing was imagining that zodiac signs and the interpretation of astrology that was done largely when he was alive during the early part of the 20th century, in the middle part of the 20th century, was what astrology is. And that's fine, but it also reveals that he didn't look to see what astrology might be. He was basically responding to what astrology practice was or is, which is the same way of the same thing as saying medieval medicine was pseudoscientific, which it was, but it was allowed to evolve into something else. And that something else became successful. As soon as we realised that we could do medicine, now if you think about it, prior to 1796, it was very similar to astrology. Medieval medicine developed into something else. So as soon as we realised about germs, we got germ theory. So it took more information, but that information came through research. And that research came because it was funded. And as I've said many, many times before, astrology wasn't funded. Medicine was. Medicine developed, astrology stayed the same. So Karl Popper's criticism is about what he perceives astrology to be, unfalsifiable. As soon as an experiment comes along where you can falsify it, i.e. we move the progressed chart into the arena rather than the natal chart, then we can start to measure progressed charts against other progressed charts because they're moving against a background. Natal charts aren't, they're fixed and static, and so we can say whatever we want about them, in the same way that you can say whatever you want about a zodiac sign. But you can't do that with a progressed chart because a progressed chart is moving against a background of time. So what we can say is, when we actually do our experiment, is that we have outcomes. We have peaks and troughs in our data that need explanation. And what Karl Popper was saying was that isn't possible with astrology. He was wrong. Simple. And so the Wikipedia Science and Astrology page, the section on falsifiability, is wrong. And in contrast to Popper, it says here, the philosopher Thomas Kuhn argued that it was not lack of falsifiability that made astrology unscientific, but rather the process and concepts of astrology are non-empirical. What he's saying is astrology is not science because it was always more akin to medieval medicine and followed a sequence of rules and guidelines for a seemingly necessary field with known shortcomings, but they did no research because the fields are not amenable to research. So they had no puzzles to solve and therefore no science to practice. Obviously this is wrong, but it's based on what Thomas Kuhn perceived astrology to be, which is exactly what Popper perceived astrology to be. Now their perception of what astrology was came from astrologers, because astrologers were sitting there with their 1,000-year-old or 2,000-year-old subject not having developed it at all. And so they're sitting there in the same way that medieval medicine would be sitting there in front of Thomas Kuhn saying, right, okay, should we do some bloodletting? No, you have to let a subject develop. You have to let a subject evolve. And astrology was not given this opportunity. We're giving it that opportunity now, and in doing so we're proving Thomas Kuhn entirely wrong. Paul Thagard's another philosopher that I've mentioned before, and I also used his relationship to demonstrate astrology. He had a progressed Sun, progressed Venus relationship with his wife, the late Zivakunda. Anyway, what he says is, or what he believes, is that astrology cannot be regarded as falsified in the same sense until it has been replaced with a successor. In the case of predicting behaviour, psychology is the alternative. To Thagard, a further criterion of demarcation of science from pseudoscience was that the state of the art must progress, and that the community of researchers should be attempting to compare the current theory to alternatives and not be selective in considering confirmations and disconfirmations. He's exactly right. He's exactly right. But of course, there's been no funding and no encouragement to progress astrology. There's no collegiate research that is funded. There's no oversight. You can say what you want as an astrologer and no one is going to strike you off. So Thagard, in a sense, is right, but all of these philosophers are wrong because their perception of what astrology is based on something that isn't actually factual. And we didn't know that until we made some progress. And the little bit of progress we did make gave us results. So we've got a feedback loop now. And that feedback loop is saying, yep, you're right, the progress chart is just like the expanding natal chart. So because the natal chart was fixed and static, and that up until 2005, we were using that as the only thing in astrology that we could use then to understand personality, then that created this belief system among philosophers that astrology is pseudoscience. What they didn't consider is it might not be. No one did. No one considered that it might not be pseudoscience. What they thought was enough experimentation had taken place to make the decision that it's a pseudoscience. Clearly, that was not the case. And so Popper, Kuhn and Thagard are all wrong. And so therefore, Wikipedia is completely wrong. So the philosopher Edward James says that astrology is irrational not because of the numerous problems with mechanisms and falsification due to experiments, but because an analysis of the astrological literature shows that it is infused with fallacious logic and poor reasoning. Now let's just go back to what he says about falsification due to experiments. There's a perception here that the experimentation done was enough to write astrology off. But then no one did enough experimentation and not enough research and development to find that the horoscope is in motion, it's not fixed. As soon as we realise this horoscope's in motion and not fixed, then the falsification via these experiments is completely in the bin. Forget it. It's not relevant anymore. What he says is, what if throughout astrological writings we meet little appreciation of coherence, blatant insensitivity to evidence, no sense of hierarchy of reasons, slight command over the contextual force of criteria, stubborn unwillingness to pursue an argument where it leads, stark naivete concerning the efficacy of explanation, and so on. In that case, I think we are perfectly justified in rejecting astrology as irrational. Astrology simply fails to meet the multifarious demands of legitimate reasoning. Well, that's not true. What he's commenting is the people in astrology who are the people who have inherited the subject. And the people who have inherited the subject are not prodigies or geniuses or even academics, because of course it's abandoned by academia. So it's been left for everybody else. Sorry guys, but we've got to say it, we've got to call it out. If you're not attracting prodigies and geniuses, you're not going to be developing your subject. And so therefore, all Edward James is commenting on is the personal characteristics of the people that do astrology. And really, it doesn't attract the sort of people that Edward James wants it to attract. But that's not the fault of astrology, and it's not the fault of the people in astrology. It's the fault of people like Edward James, because they are the same people that stopped funding it and relegated it to pseudoscience. So this is not about the people in astrology. They didn't do this to themselves. They've kept it alive. When people like Edward James, Thomas Kuhn, Paul Thagard and Karl Popper, people like them, attempted to destroy it. But it didn't die. Okay, Quinean dichotomy. Quinean logic suggests that you can accept astrology, but you have to reject all of the sciences that astrology contradicts, or belief in astrology contradicts. That's not true anymore either, simply because as soon as you get an experimental outcome, and you start to explain astrology for what it really is, which is associated with consciousness, not nature, it no longer competes against physics, for example. It no longer competes against psychology. Psychology was created by essentially natural science to explain human behaviour. But because astrology lives in a domain where it only really can possibly be true if we live in some sort of simulation, and it can only really be true if consciousness is separate to matter. So they're two different domains. Now you can continue to say that it's not true because that's not true. That's great. That's a great argument. It's not true, but it's a great argument, and that's where you should be arguing from. But what you can't argue is that astrology competes with physics and so contradicts physics. It does not. So therefore Quinian logic does not apply anymore now that we've found outcomes that associate astrology with events in consciousness, not events in nature. It goes on to say on the page that lack of consistency, testing the validity of astrology can be difficult because there's no consensus among astrologers as to what astrology is and what it can predict. Obviously, if your subject was destroyed 360 years ago and you had to reclaim it somehow or rebuild it somehow without any funding, you'd get a similar situation. So don't argue that case. It's basically what you're saying is academia abandoned astrology, so this is the outcome of academic abandonment. We can actually see what it looks like now from a forensic perspective. If you abandon a subject, it'll end up looking like astrology. But we can also rescue the subject, and that subject means that one day there will be a consensus among astrologers, because astrologers will be different kinds of people. There will be a different consensus. But the most important thing about astrology now is that because we know that it's true, or we know that some part of it's true, we can actually start helping people with it. And so therefore that means it will attract people. In time it will attract people who can make a difference to this consensus. At the moment we can't. But in the future we will be able to. And that's why this podcast is called A 22nd Century Science. To get rid of the ideas that Kuhn and James and Popper and Thagard and the guerrilla skeptics on Wikipedia's Astrology and Science page, they have to die off for these ideas really to be accepted. And that's just the way science works. There are some more claims on this page, and one is about the lack of physical basis, the fact that the zodiac is a human construct. Yeah, absolutely, it's a field. Talked about that before. It's like a football field. But lack of predictive power? Some astrologers make claims that the positions of all the planets must be taken into account, but astrologers were unable to predict the existence of Neptune based on mistakes in horoscopes. I'm not sure what that means. But the fact of the matter is, we're looking at a fixed chart, a fixed horoscope, which has some value because it's the basis of the moving horoscope. It does have some value, but we can only give it a value and test it by looking at it in relationship to the moving horoscope. So anything that is said on this page that doesn't take that into account makes the page entirely and completely out of date and irrelevant. So the Astrology and Science Wikipedia page is entirely out of date and entirely irrelevant based on discoveries that we've made since 2005. I think it's also important to remember that there are lots of astrologers that don't really want astrology to be a science. It interrupts their income stream. Seriously. One astrologist said, if you want to do a lot of worthwhile work for which you will not be thanked or paid, do research. When he said that, he wasn't saying that to save your time, to save you stop wasting your time. He was saying that because he suspected that something might be discovered, and that something probably was going to contradict some of the things that he believed or said. And so there's a belief among astrologers that research is a really bad idea, especially if you're making a living. Maybe I'm a little bit cynical or skeptical in this respect, but I actually believe that there are plenty of people who don't really want to be regulated. They don't really want to have a true understanding of the subject. They like to keep it mystical. And then there's the other people. There are plenty of people out there, real con artists who are charlatans, who use it just to prey on people. And that's easy because it's not regulated. That's not the fault of astrology. That's the fact that it wasn't regulated. It wasn't regulated because it's not an academic subject. So therefore we can lay the blame entirely and utterly on rationalists, because they created this situation. They created an abandoned subject, which basically went to work in the circus rather than at the university. And so we end up with this subject that we've got today. But what I did, and I say I now, what I did was I discovered a Rosetta Stone that enabled us to interpret the subject. Now that Rosetta Stone is two things. It's first of all that the chart moves. Doesn't stay still, it moves through time. And the second thing is, because in order for us to recognise that the horoscope moves, we have to be able to compare it against something else. And synastry already existed. Progressed synastry didn't. Some things have been noted by Penny Thornton, Robert Blaschke, and a couple of other people, but no one had ever done any work there. So the other part of this was we can compare charts in synastry, relationship astrology, and that gives us the Rosetta Stone for the rest of astrology. So we understand now, by reading these progressed horoscopes, by reading these charts, we can understand using empirical methods. Basically we're looking at events in time, events in consciousness playing out through time. And we're also looking at statistics as well, which is great. But that gives us this Rosetta Stone that enables us to understand astrology, and it enables us to look again at every other part of astrology. Or it will do one day. We can't at the moment because we're just simply not funded to do it. But at some stage, someone's going to realise that this works and they're going to fund it. And I'm not going to fund any more because I spent enough. But if you know anybody that wants to, you can get them to contact me and we can talk about what they need to do next. Anyway, you've been watching A 22nd Century Science, where we say astrology is not what you think it is. Tune in next week for another video podcast.
It's still in the game. Somebody's pulling your chain. About 22nd century science.